So the first thing we're going to do is remove state from this counter component. So we're just going to delete these two lines here. We're going to remove the set state from increment and decrement. And we'll fill these in later. Once this is wired up with Redux, the count is going to be coming in by a prop. So we'll change this .state.count to this .props.count. When we save the app, we see that the count disappears, which is expected because it's not anywhere to be found anymore. And we're not passing it in yet. So we could verify that this change worked by going over to index and passing in count 42. And then we see it appears here. But we'll take that out for now because we're going to be getting it from Redux soon enough. Now let's take one small step towards getting Redux into this app by connecting this component to Redux. First step there is to import connect from React Redux. And then we use that function down at the bottom to connect the component before we export it. If we save this, we're going to get an error because we haven't created a Redux store yet, and there's no way for this thing to get any data. But this is still a step in the right direction. So this function call might look a little strange because it's being called twice here. This is because connect is a higher order function. So when we call it, it actually returns a function that we then call with this counter component. And that in turn returns a new component that gets exported. So we're not exporting the counter anymore, we're actually exporting the connected counter. So even though we've connected this component to our theoretical Redux store, we haven't told it which data to pull out of the store yet. See, when you connect a component to Redux, it doesn't give you all of the data it has. It relies on you to tell it what you need. And you do that by providing a function called mapState2Props. This function takes the entire Redux state and is expected to return an object where the keys are prop names and the values are prop values. So it really does create a mapping from state into props. Let's pretend for a second that the state we're passing in looks something like this. It's just an object with a single property called count. Looks an awful lot like the component state we had before. So if that's the shape of this state, and we want to pass in the count prop from it, we want to create a key in this object called count and pull out state.count. Now this still won't work because we still don't have a store, and we'll take care of that shortly. But we have everything set up so that once we do have a state in the right shape, this component will receive its count. So we've connected the component to Redux, we've set up the mapState2Props function. Now let's go create the store. So we're going to switch over to our index.js file. And to create the store, Redux provides a function called createStore. So we can import createStore from Redux. And then all we have to do is say const store equals createStore. So before we deal with this error here, I want to do one more thing, which is to provide the store to our app. Remember in counter, we've connected the counter, but the connect function is expecting to see a store. And merely creating the store here doesn't magically make it available to the connect function. We actually need to use a provider component to do that. And that provider component comes from React Redux. So we can import provider from React Redux, and then we wrap the root of our app with this provider. The provider takes one prop called store, and we pass in the Redux store. Now let's take care of this error. This is happening because the createStore function expects one argument, which is a reducer function. This reducer function is something that we're supposed to create to tell Redux what the initial state of the store is. So let's create one of those now. Create a function called reducer. It won't take any arguments, and it won't return anything right now, which is the same thing as returns undefined. And we'll pass the reducer into createStore. Now we get a new error saying that we can't read property count of undefined. And this is because state is undefined. We're not returning anything from the reducer, so the initial state is undefined, and when we run this mapState2Props function, this is undefined, and this fails. So how can we fix that? Well, we can return a value here that is in the proper shape. So we can return an object with a count with some number. And now the app is working again. We have a counter, value of 42, but it doesn't work yet because if you remember, we ripped out the increment and decrement functions. These don't do anything yet. But we are successfully initializing the state, passing it down, and Redux is now providing the counter with the value. So a second ago, I mentioned that the reducer is responsible for supplying the initial state for Redux. And that's true, but it actually does a lot more than that, and we haven't fully implemented it here yet. The reducer is actually given two arguments. It's given state and an action. So anytime something happens, Redux calls this reducer with the current state and the action that just happened. And this function is responsible for returning the new state. Now, the first time that Redux calls this reducer, state is set to undefined. And that's kind of your cue to return the initial state. So one way to do that would be to say if state is undefined, return something here. But a nicer way to do it is to set up an initial state above the reducer, and then to use ES6 default arguments to assign that state when state is undefined. Now remember, the reducer does actually need to return the state. It can't just set it here. So we'll return the state here, and then things are back to working. So now we've created the store, we created the reducer, and we provided the store to the app using the provider component. All that's left is to wire up the actions. So far, this app is pretty lame. It doesn't really do anything. It just displays a static number and you can't change it. A simple app like this counter is great for teaching Redux because there's not much going on and you can focus on the pieces that make Redux different from plain React, like creating the store and making a reducer and passing it down via a provider, connecting it to the component, and mapping state to props. But let me be clear, Redux is total overkill for something so simple. If you're making a simple app like this, or just have a couple pieces of state, you probably don't need Redux at all. So I don't want you walking away from this thinking that you should be adding Redux to every single app you make, or that you're going to be burdened with all this boilerplate for even simple apps with 2 buttons. That's just not true. Don't feel like you have to use Redux if your app is simple enough and React State works fine for you. So that said, let's wire up these actions. So how do we get actions into this reducer? We can't just call the reducer directly. Well, turns out store has a function on it called dispatch. And if we look at the Redux docs for store, it says the only way to change the state inside is to dispatch an action on it. And if we look at the store methods, there's one called dispatch that takes an action. And there's a couple other ones that we'll talk about later. So we can call store.dispatch and pass in an action object. Now this is just a plain JavaScript object. The only thing special about it is that it should have a type property. And we'll say the type is increment. And I'm also going to go into the reducer and add a console log that just logs out the action that we get. And we'll open up the console. If I refresh the app, we see we get 2 actions. One is this Redux init thing, and this is happening when Redux first calls the reducer. That's the time when the state is undefined and the action is this Redux/init. And then the second time is our dispatch here. So there's no magic going on here. This is passing in this literal object into here. It's not changing it or anything. And if I go and change this, you'll see that it passes it in faithfully, and I can add other properties to this, like an amount property with some number, and you can see it's reflected here. Let me just put this back. So now that we have a way of getting actions into the reducer, we just need to handle them and do the right thing. And we can do that by writing a simple switch statement on action.type. And when the type is increment, we just need to return a new state with a count equal to the old state.count plus 1. And when I save this, we see the count becomes 43 because we are dispatching this increment action and it's making it into the reducer. And then when the state changes, the app re-renders. Now we're getting this warning because we don't have a default case. So instead of returning the state at the bottom, we'll just move this into a default. It's important to always return the state unchanged if this reducer doesn't know how to handle the action it's been given. Redux will actually dispatch every action to every reducer in the system. We've already seen a preview of this when Redux dispatched its Redux init action, so make sure to have that default case in place. Let's also add the decrement action while we're here, which will be pretty much the same as increment. Just change the type, and we can change plus to a minus. If we save, there's no change, but then we can duplicate this dispatch and replace increment with decrement. And then we see the counter is back at 42. So we're almost there. All we have to do now is dispatch these actions from increment and decrement inside counter. But how can we do that here without access to the store and the store dispatch function like we have here? Well, the connect function actually injects the dispatch function as a prop. And we can prove that if we go over to the React Dev Tools and drill down into our counter component. You notice it's getting the count prop from map state to props, and it's also getting dispatch from connect. So when we want to dispatch an action from this component, all we have to do is call the dispatch function. So let's do that here. This.props.dispatch type increment. Hey, it works. Then we just need to do the same thing in decrement. Just copy this line, paste it here, change increment to decrement. And there we go, the counter is working. Then we can just go into index and tidy up a couple things here, reset the counter to 0, and delete these two dispatches that we're not using anymore. And there we go. So just to recap, what's going on here? We're using the create store function from Redux to create a store. We're passing in a reducer, which decides what the initial state is and how the state changes as it receives actions. It ignores actions that it doesn't understand by returning the state unchanged. And then we take this store and pass it down to our component tree via this provider component, which comes from React Redux. Having the provider in place means that our counter component can connect to Redux and pull out data. So it uses the connect function from React Redux to do that. Connect uses this map state to props function that we wrote to take the entire state and turn that into props that it'll inject into counter, and it also injects the dispatch function. The injected count prop is displayed here, and then when you click the buttons, actions are dispatched, which get fed into the reducer, and the reducer decides the new state. After it returns that state, provider takes care of re-rendering the app with the new state, passing it down to counter, and then we see the new value reflected here. Now, provider isn't detecting these changes by magic. If we go back to the Redux docs, remember these store methods we saw earlier, and we're using the dispatch one. There's also one called subscribe, which takes a listener function. And the store will call this function every time the state changes. So provider subscribes to the store, and when it's notified of a change, it tells React to re-render. So that's it. We've refactored the counter app to use Redux instead of React State.